All right. Gabrielle, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
I am so good. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. I've actually followed some of your work for a while. Because you were known as like the gut specialist person in the fitness industry for a long
Yeah.
time. And I'd listened to you on a bunch of podcasts before, which is really cool to have you on now. And I know you did some writing for a lot of companies that are well known, like I know PN. Um,
hmm
who else did you do some writing for?
Yeah. Precision Nutrition, Girls Gone Strong, Barbend, Examine.
Yeah, these are some big
Um,
dogs. These are some big dog companies right now. Like
yeah,
very
I think I was,
respected.
yeah. And I'm like, I used to do more on like the magazine side of things years ago. And I think I was in like one of the actual physical copies of, I want to say like Oxygen magazine. And I was like, wow, I've made it.
That's vintage. That was
Yeah.
making it. Now it's like whatever, but that's actually unreal.
Yeah. It's wild to think back on it.
So I think we should start by introducing you to the audience. Like kind of tell us uh who you are,
Mhm.
what you do, and like kind of how you got here, because you do have an interesting backstory. So I think it'd be very interesting to like do a deep dive into that.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, this will be relatable to anyone else who has ADHD because I've done so many like course changes over time. Um, but yeah, so I would say that I'm known on Instagram as Vitamin PhD. My real name is Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro. So I have my doctorate in human metabolism, and I studied the link between the gut microbiome and human metabolism, especially metabolic derangements like type 2 diabetes. And before that, my bachelor's was in exercise science. And so I kind of got my start thinking that I was going to run a gym. And then in undergrad, I realized I didn't actually want to do that. And I loved teaching. And so I went on to get my doctorate in a lab that actually was more focused on skeletal muscle hypertrophy. But through a series of unfortunate events, the samples that we collected for that project, most of them were lost to just storage issues. And so my side project looking at probiotic supplementation became my main project. And that was back in like the early 20 teens. So it was kind of
Hmm.
before gut health was a thing.
Yeah, I was actually the first thing I was gonna say there. I was like, wait, were you were in the gut game before it became this like highly Instagram like pseudoscientific thing with just people throwing so much random shit around.
Yeah. It was
Damn.
back in, yeah, I think I finished in 2014. So, wow, a decade ago already.
Mm.
And then I went on to teach, but in exercise science. So I really had no intention to do anything with gut health. It was like, this is a means to an end, so I can get my doctorate and I can, work it in higher ed. And I did that for 4 years. And I focused more during that time on sport nutrition. And I taught anatomy and phys and kind of like the intro and honors exercise science courses and clubs. And after 4 years of that, I was recruited by Renaissance Periodization.
Yeah.
And it was actually, yeah, so it was Mike Israetel that recommended that I start talking about gut health because it was like starting to come on the scene in 2017.
Yeah, you
And
got like Bitcoin at like 20 cents at that point.
seriously, I know I'm a gut health hipster.
That's unreal.
So yeah. It's like I can't even take credit for full credit for ending up where I have. It was just sort of like where preparation meets opportunity, and I wonder too, like how much maybe the early podcast contributed to like how it picked up in the fitness industry. Because my first podcast was with Steve Hall with Revive Stronger.
Okay, yeah.
And yeah, so that was that back in 2017. It was my first ever podcast, and I prepared for that like I was getting ready for a dissertation. I was like, I was
I
so
can always
nervous.
tell when a fitness professional comes from academia because it's like here's 20 hours of free labor for nothing, and then you compare
Yeah.
it to someone who's actually making money in the fitness industry is like, yeah, I read one like tweet and now I'm actually gonna sell a product.
Yes, yeah, that is exactly it. I've had to learn over time like what is actually a good fit for like podcast information and presenting and whatnot because the first couple of talks that I gave with RP were so technical and
Yeah.
so academic. And I remember Mike being like, you probably don't have to do that. Like
He's like,
you could
Gabby, you
probably
know
give it a little less.
you're not getting peer reviewed for this podcast.
Yes. That's exactly it. I was just like, people, what if I don't know something, And it's like, no, I'll be
Yeah, I
fine. I'll
know.
be fine.
I know that because of my sibling. They are a PhD as well. So
Okay. Yeah.
like I've I actually, ironically, I never even went to university, and
Oh,
they
wow.
are a PhD, but I just got like an adjacent experience of how much labor goes into it. And then
Hmm.
actually, the first time I heard you was on the Stronger by Science podcast,
Okay. Yep.
and like those guys are academics too, so it's like
Oh,
just
yes.
doing so much work as
Hmm.
opposed to like what was mainstream is. I'm like, I don't even know if the people who are mainstreaming a lot of this information have ever read a journal article. In full transparency, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think most of the time not, because the so much of what's lost in terms of like nuance and fine details come from a knowledge and experience in gut microbiome research.
Yeah,
So, without that, understandably, it's difficult to interpret the articles. I mean, it's difficult to even like look at a forest plot and be like, what is that actually telling me? Or like PCOA plot, because they're so different from what we're used to in nutrition and fitness, which is like bar charts and line graphs.
yeah,
And then some of the terminology is just not familiar, unless you've taken like a microbiology or an ecology course. So it is very easy to not know necessarily what you're talking about, because no one else does either, and so they like don't know whether you're wrong or not.
yeah. No, that makes total sense. So you get out of that, and then you're teaching at within you're teaching within exercise science, correct?
Yeah. So I was teaching in Georgia for 4 years, and yeah, in exercise science. And then in my fourth year, that's when I was recruited by RP, but I would only had a really small number of clients because I couldn't take on too many while I was teaching full time. And going into my fifth year, I was going to have to go up for promotion, which is like their version of tenure.
Mm,
And I needed to get like two publications. And the institution that I was at the time didn't have a dedicated like research lab. Like I didn't have research space. So it was very difficult to procure that and do any sort of research, that's publication worthy. And on top of the teaching load, and then there was a pretty high administrative load as well. So I was like advising students. I was on way too many, boards, and the experience that I was having there was very different from what I had at my graduate alma mater at Virginia Tech. And I realized that what I wanted out of teaching was not accessible to me at that institution. And I was far more fulfilled by coaching. And there
mm.
is an educational aspect to coaching. And my coaching then was actually very different from how it is now. But I decided that I didn't want to go up for promotion. And essentially, you kind of have to like commit or leave. You can't
Yeah,
stay in academia forever and be like, I don't know.
you can be one foot in the
Um,
door of academia.
right,
Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, I decided to resign and went into coaching full time. And I ended up on the speaker circuit with RP. That's Renaissance periodization for anyone who's not familiar. I should say that.
yeah. That's
And
thanks for clearing that up because I knew what you're talking
yeah,
about, but I'm like everyone's gonna be
yeah,
like,
just in case.
who?
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't know
Um,
RP?
so yeah, I spent 4 years with them, and it was really fantastic. I mean, there was international speaking engagements. Like I've gotten to travel around the world speaking about gut health and behavior change, and I wouldn't have traded that for anything. I mean, it was really an amazing experience. I remember when I was still teaching, I saw one of RP's ads for their Australia conference. And I remember turning to my friend and saying, like, wow, wouldn't that be something to be able to like travel around the world and talk about sport nutrition? Because I was so in love with sport nutrition at that time. And then like a year later, I was doing that. I was in Australia, like giving a talk. And it just felt so surreal that
In
that
one
my
year
life
that
had gone
happened.
in that direction. Yeah. And it was because Mike saw me posting in the International Society of Sport Nutrition Facebook group,
Mm.
and I was just having like a collegial debate. And I had a little sport nutrition blog at that time. And you want to talk about like unpaid labor? I'm like
Oh my God.
full
Blogs.
citations.
Blogs are, I have a
Yes.
blog and I've put thousands of hours in that. I'm
Yeah.
like, I have the Squarespace data. I'm like, 8 people have read this and it might be me 7 times.
Uh-huh. Yeah. But there's just something about it. I'm like, I need to create.
I agree.
Um, yeah. So he messaged me on Facebook and was like, hey, I have a business proposition for you. And I'm like, who is this guy? Like, seems kind of familiar, but what a strange message. And then I realized, oh, this is Mike Israel from RP. Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. And yeah, so it was just wild how that turned out. So yeah, after 4 years with them, that's kind of when our paths started to diverge a little bit, because I started to speak and read and write much more about weight neutral approaches to coaching,
Mm,
and sort of the inherent risks of what I call intentional weight loss, or like more so cosmetic weight loss, and intentional physique change for the purpose of liking your body and therefore yourself more.
yeah.
And the kind of widespread prescription of macro tracking and counting, without vetting sort of like whether this is appropriate for this client or not, because it was so normalized. So that was back in 2019. And I started also to speak about intuitive eating, because that term had entered the scene colloquially, and people were having full debates about the utility and validity of intuitive eating without actually knowing what the term meant. And
Mm.
that blew my mind, because I'm like, we're not having productive conversations about this. And I was even guilty of that myself, until I decided, maybe I should look into the research. Maybe I should read the book. Maybe I should know what the hell I'm talking about before I'm running my mouth about it. And
It's
so
always so
that's,
humbling when that happens.
yes, yes,
When
like,
you hear about a term 1,000 times and you think you have an idea, and then you go to the
mm-hmm.
source material and you're like, I'm a dumbass. I like this. What was I didn't even know anything.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. And so I'm like, part of my goal back in 2019 was really just to once again create, but to create information around that term and help people understand it, so at least they could have maybe more productive conversations, and like really know what they were talking about. If two people are having a discussion about a concept but they have different understandings of that concept,
Mm,
they're talking about two different things.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it was probably maybe a year into that process, in about 2020, that RP and I went our separate ways. And then from there, I started just working more with my own clients. And so I had already formed Vitamin PhD Nutrition, but it was much more of a consultancy prior to that, more on like gut health information. And during that shift, that's when Shannon and I created the comprehensive coaching framework, the spectrum of intentional eating, and the shape of my coaching completely changed. And I also started writing for Examine, and I think also Barbend at that time. So I had a lot a lot
Yeah,
going on.
that
Yeah.
is a lot. One thing I'll say
Yeah.
is for the listeners, when she said Shannon, she actually referring to Shannon Beer, who
Yes.
y'all will
Yes.
remember was on the Body Neutrality podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys are working together on that kind of stuff. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
before you were doing that, I assume when you were with RP, because they do work with a lot of aesthetic based goals and like
Mm-hmm.
bodybuilders and physique competitors. So were
Yeah.
you more working with people along weight loss lines then? And then what changed? Like what inspired you to kind of divert from that?
Yeah. So yeah, I was back then a macros based weight loss coach for the most part. I mean, there were people who wanted to focus on muscle gain, but probably over 90% of the clients were focused on fat loss. And Shannon actually was as well. Like, she had her background in macro based coaching, more for physique change. And I
That's
think
the
we
gateway
both,
drug to coaching.
yes, yeah, it really is. Yeah.
Really
It was
lures
like
you in.
you,
You're like,
you
yeah. And then you're like, oh, okay, never mind. There's so much more here.
yeah. Yes, exactly. And I don't know, I can't pinpoint one specific moment where things shifted, but Shannon and I started to actually spend time together in person back in 2019. She came stateside, we spent time together. And I remember, like, at that time we were speaking about the challenges that we were facing as macro coaches, working with clients that were like repeat customers, because they
Mm,
would work with us, they would lose body fat, and then they would regain some or all or more of it, and then they would come back again. And it was like, what's going on? Because there was so much rhetoric in the industry at that time about people lacking motivation and self-control and self-discipline, and so many people internalized the idea that they were doing something wrong and they just
mm.
needed to try harder. And so they would want like a stricter macro approach. And we were like, this is clearly not working as intended. Like,
Yeah.
something's off here. And that intersected with my starting to learn about intuitive eating. And I do remember one of the first things that we worked on together was an article that I wrote, I believe it was in 2019, and it was called Intuition in Eating and Training. And it's still somewhere on the internet. And in that article, I talked about what intuitive eating actually is, and I helped people understand it by comparing it to autoregulation. And autoregulation, there was a video that Mike Tusherer put out from, oh gosh, I don't know, years before that, and he was explaining things in the same way that I was explaining things, because in the beginning, people weren't really on board with autoregulation, with RPE based training, because they're like,
Yeah.
it's just based on your feelings. And
Yeah.
Mike Tusher, he had to explain, like,
I can't imagine someone in the fitness industry saying that.
yes, he's like, I don't mean that it's based on your emotions that day. I
Uh,
mean, it's based on, like internal signals and like an understanding of the other aspects of your life that can influence how you feel physically and mentally, because they're connected on a given day, and to use that for course corrections in your training. Because it doesn't matter if your program says hit 85% of your 1 rep max. Your 1 rep max that day is different from what it was 2 weeks ago.
mm,
And so I was like, maybe this is a way to help people understand what intuitive eating actually is.
yeah.
That it's not emotional eating. It is an internally auto-regulated form of eating. And then actually intuitive eating is even more than that. But I was trying to explain to people at least just the eating part, just the food intake part, that we use this same biofeedback in the gym.
Yeah.
We can, it's possible for us to use that in the kitchen. And so that's one thing that Shannon and I started to work on. And I really think that was the catalyst, because as we started to look more and more into the weight neutral literature and the disordered eating literature and the links to macro tracking, it was like, oh, I'm actually kind of causing harm to some people.
I did that.
Yeah.
That's a tough go. Like that was when I
Yes.
first was like reading some of the kind of the downside of like I guess strict macro tracking,
Mm-hmm.
the repetitive attempts of weight loss over time,
Yes.
realizing the potential harm that I was doing to clients. Like it sent me in a real existential dread where I was like, oh
Mm-hmm.
my God, like what am I doing? Like this is because I was
Yes.
making so much weight loss content at the time. And
Mm-hmm.
I will admit a lot of the weight loss content I always made was more nuanced in the sense that I myself had struggled with a lot of weight issues in my life. And I knew
Same.
that like
Mm-hmm.
the double down technique was not an effective one. So I
Right.
was straddling that line, but I do remember at
Mm-hmm.
one point being like, oh my God, I'll never help someone with weight loss again. Like what's going on? And I almost
Yes.
overcorrected. Like I couldn't hold
Mm-hmm.
space for that, like that middle ground. And I've made
Right.
better progress with it. But that feeling is dreadful because you're
Yeah.
really surrounded by an entire industry that feeds into it. And
Mm-hmm.
you're all in an immediate sense, you're really financially motivated or you're financially incentivized to
Mm-hmm.
continue leaning into it because it does
For
prey
sure.
on a lot of the
Yes.
customers' insecurities and prior belief systems and the
Yeah.
larger belief system in a whole. They all really feed into each other to
Oh
send
yeah.
you down just in a relentless pursuit for thinness or a certain
Yes.
body image, right? And you can sell the
Yeah.
hell out of that.
Oh, absolutely. And you can sell based on people's, pain points. You can sell to their insecurities, and you can promote very easily as well in market, because you have a visible physical change in a
Yeah.
person. And when you're focused on a weight neutral approach, it's much harder because you can't see the internal changes that a person has experienced.
Hmm.
Like, how can you capture a person's ability to regulate their emotions better? Like, how can you capture a person's enhanced fulfillment and joy in their day-to-day life? It's so challenging, and it's so nuanced and abstract. And like you mentioned, it's hard to pin down, like, what exactly do you do? Like, what do I call this? Because I want to say it's lifestyle coaching, and it is in a way, but when people hear lifestyle, they think exercise and nutrition. And that's not what it is.
Mm.
That's usually the gateway to people focusing on other aspects of their life when they realize, wow, my life has become very small because all I do is like focus on my body and worry about it and worry about food. And I'm not doing the things that I want to do or that I enjoy doing because I'm so preoccupied about how I look while I'm doing it, or preoccupied about not being able to count and track my macros. When we start moving away from that, we start freeing up the mental and physical energy and just time people are like, oh, wow, I have now the capacity to pursue other things in my life. Like I can still fuel myself. I feel like I eat a meal, I enjoy it, and I move on. And I'm not held back by how I look in shorts or a bathing suit. I go on trips. I go out with my friends. Like now I want to focus on building other aspects of my life out. But when I say like lifestyle coaching or like flourishing health coaching, those terms are still really unfamiliar to people, and they are so large that I can't show what I'm going to do with a person by saying like, well, here's your macro spreadsheet.
Yeah. No, because basically what you're describing is the feeling I think a lot of people are pursuing when they inquire for coaching and they want help is they're looking for a feeling and they can only
Mm,
imagine ascertain that feeling with a outcome, and the outcome is weight loss, right? You're just kind of
yes.
cutting out the middleman where you're like,
Yep.
well, you think you need weight loss in order to live a life that you find like actually enjoyable, and you'll
Mm-hmm.
attach the image of being thinner and everything associated with that as that's the only way you can achieve it, but you actually don't have to. You can
Right.
get there without doing it. We all have our own level of internalized things we got to work through, because it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter who you are. We've internalized to varying degrees the value of like thinness or a certain
Oh,
level of body
yes.
image, right? And some people
Yeah.
maybe have it a little less, some people have it more, but I don't know if there's ever a point where you're fully over it. You are managing it to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
Like I got
Yeah.
27 years under my belt of like really being into it, and about
Right.
3 years of kind of trying to redo it. But I'm not gonna lie, whenever I have like got a little leaner, I'm not completely neutral about it. I'm like, damn, hell yeah.
Right.
And I don't think that's inherently a problem, but it's not
Mhm.
guiding my life in the way that it was before. And to your
Yes.
point, it opens up a lot of time because I never
Right.
realized it's a full-time job managing. I don't want to say an eating disorder because I was never diagnosed, but I had a lot of
Mhm.
disordered patterns, especially around binge
Right.
eating. And I was
Yep.
like, full-time job managing that.
Yes. Yeah, because it is a preoccupation. That's how
Yeah.
you know that it's problematic. Like macro tracking, one thing I think that's important in this middle space, like you mentioned, like finding that gray area, is that I'm not dogmatic about macro tracking. I'm not dogmatic even about intentional weight loss. I am intentional about informing people of the risks, and I choose what I coach based on my perceived cost to benefit ratio and what I feel good about helping people with.
Yeah.
So, for example, when we look at macro tracking, there are people that say macro tracking doesn't cause eating disorders. No, it doesn't, but it doesn't have to cause them to still be problematic for certain people.
Mm.
And it's the same thing with intentional weight loss. It doesn't cause eating disorders, but it doesn't have to for it to be problematic for certain people. So, macro tracking, when you give someone who's never tracked macros before and has no body image disturbance and just wants to like learn about macros, and you have them track retroactively, they're like, okay, cool, I learned. That's not inherently problematic. It's the backdrop of the client. It's, does this person already have body image disturbance? Do they already have a difficult relationship with food? Are they like yo yo dieting? Then macros on the backdrop of that person, that is potentially problematic. It's very risky to have
Yeah.
that person use macro tracking. And it's the same thing with intentional weight loss. The analogy that I use is that it's like a contact sport. So there's always inherent risk. You can mitigate the risk with proper protective equipment and technique. So, for example, when we're talking about like protective equipment for a person who wants to pursue intentional weight loss, ensuring that they have a flexible body image. A technique would be something that is appropriate for them, that's very sustainable for the duration of the intentional weight loss. Maybe it's not macros, maybe it's plate planning. And and the way that the situation in which I would coach for intentional weight loss and like feel like I've not contributed harm is an example of a person who's in a weight class sport. So there's a utility to that
Mm.
weight modification because they're in a weight class sport. And knowing that, okay, they've got solid body image flexibility, they haven't had any issues doing this in the past. This is really just a part of the physique utilized in their sport. Then that's a situation in which I'm like, okay, we mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Yeah.
But with a client who has, yeah, the body image disturbance and like a challenging relationship with food, I think people on both sides, I think both clients and coaches think that helping the person to achieve their ideal physique improves their body image. And that is a complete misunderstanding. It doesn't actually improve their body image in a I should say like in a practical way. They can like the way that their body looks much more, and that is one aspect. But when we're talking about actually improving body image, we're talking about improving body image flexibility and reducing the attachment they have to their appearance.
Yeah.
So making them look the way that they like it, and they like it and they feel good about their body. What happens if they regain the weight? It is completely contingent on the way they look, and that's not actually improving their body image.
Yeah, they're not
And
protected
so,
from those feelings anymore.
yes,
They're just
yes,
in a space
exactly.
right now where it's not necessarily a problem, but
Yep.
if anything under
Mm-hmm.
their control were to push them back into it, they're pretty much
Mm-hmm.
back at square one. I'd almost use
Exactly.
it as like an analogy of like they won the lottery or they inherited a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
money, but they didn't
Yep.
change any of their behaviors. And then so
Yes.
for the next year, they're like, yo, life is sick. I'm vacationing. I
Mm-hmm.
have I still have zero impulse control over my spending, but I have such a I won $1 million. So until
Yeah.
that dries up, life is good. But then
Right.
one day they'll be right back there and be like, oh shit, they might have had a fun year, but their life
Mm-hmm.
and I guess their self-efficacy, their
Mm-hmm.
image flexibility, the things that are portable skills that really matter for long-term like mental health and
Yep.
physical health as well. None of
Mm-hmm.
them were worked on. They were just kind of like given the resource to mitigate the shitty feelings that come with the inevitable spot they'll be back in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to not feel triggered when you're not being triggered.
Yeah,
Right? Like life
yeah.
is good. My existence feels very easy right now. But as soon as that triggering experience comes back up, you will find, oh, it actually doesn't matter really what my body looks like because I can still have a trigger that brings up those same thoughts and those same feelings. And like how many times have people reached their goal weight or their goal physique and it doesn't even register? They're like, oh, I don't like myself anymore actually than I thought that I was going to. I don't feel that much happier. My life is very much the same as it was before. I just feel now much more preoccupied about how I look and what I'm eating.
Mm. It's like you reach that goal weight and you're like the light bulb goes off and you're like, wow, I didn't hate my body. I just hate myself.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And that's
Exactly.
that's uncomfortable. You're because that you're
Mm-hmm.
almost like it was so much easier when I just hated my body. Because like I'm 10 pounds away from
Yes.
happiness. That's
Yes.
actually almost an easier place to hang because
Mm-hmm.
you're like the carrot's right there and you're like it's within reach. But then when
Yep.
you get the carrot and you're like, God, my
Mm-hmm.
nothing is like I don't live in this dream state that I anticipated. Like that's a really
Yes.
shitty feeling because then you realize you got some stuff you got to work on, and you
Mm-hmm.
have two choices there. I guess you can actually be like, all right, we got to go deeper, or
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate. A lot of people just double down.
Yeah. They're like, oh, I guess I need to lose more weight. I need to be
Yeah,
smaller. And I think, but see, that is what is sold to people is the idea that like, if you lose weight, if you're at your smallest self, you're going to feel better about yourself and society is going to like you more. And
that's
unfortunately,
true.
I think it's, yeah, yes, exactly. So every time I have this conversation, I think it's so important to point out that like, it's not just a fitness industry thing. This is a societal issue.
Mm,
And the fact is that society has for the last 100 years, at least in the US, judged people in larger bodies and labeled them as lazy, as not being good citizens, and so that has had like just a stronghold. And that was really also when calorie counting and macro tracking emerged as well. So it is fine and dandy to say, like, hey, you can accept yourself and like, love and respect yourself. You're deserving of love and respect, regardless of your body size. And that is true. And also, it is more difficult to exist in a large body. And when we lose weight, we get compliments and people recognize that. When we gain weight, no one says it.
yeah,
No one says anything about it. So it's like we're up against our internal environment and we can change that, but we can't really change the external environment. And so it's about changing that internal environment enough that you can cope with
mm,
the way that the external environment is around you, the way that people perceive you. And hopefully that changes in time. And I think, I've seen so much change in the industry just in the last 5 years because, like, I don't think that I'm screaming into the void anymore like I was back then. But still, the reality of the situation is it is difficult to not be in your smallest, leanest body.
No,
And yeah,
yeah, 100%.
sometimes it
Like
can suck. Yep.
that is something that I think that, and I think I've seen you talk about this, but it is something that's very important in the fitness industry is because the fitness industry is so, um, I would almost use it as like in a political term. It's like very neoliberal, where it's like individualism is everything, and
Yes.
everything you get from this is from what you put in. And
Mm-hmm.
like the thing that bothers me about that is like to a certain degree, like fitness is a little different than some other spaces in the world where like
Yeah.
you'll inherit your genes, which are they're riddled with privilege. Like anyone who's ever read the individual results of a study are like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
these two people did the exact same protocol, supervised under the exact same into everything, and one person gained 4 times more muscle. One
Yeah.
person like did a whole strength training program from being untrained and literally gained no muscle. I've seen
Yeah.
that. And like the
Yep.
twin study, the one I remember where they housed them for like 84 days and they gave them a
Mm-hmm.
thousand calories extra for the whole time. One person gained 30 pounds, one person
Yeah.
gained like 10. And I'm like,
Yep.
that's privilege regardless, but it's not as exponentially different as like wealth. Like if you inherit
Mm-hmm.
$1 billion, you inherit a billion, like that's different, right? So I
Yeah.
guess the gap is tighter, but it still exists, like the inherent differences. But
Oh, for
because
sure.
of that, people really think that fitness is this purely meritocratic thing, and like
Right.
your body is a reflection of how much effort you put into. And I
Mm-hmm.
think when I got in the industry, I thought that too, because I consider one of myself one of those the used to be fat people that then judges fat
Mm.
people. Like I
Yes. Oof.
see I did it, so why can't they? Like I used to be really like that when I lost like 60 pounds when I was a grade 8. And I was like,
Yeah.
then I almost became a pick me for like thin people where
Mm-hmm.
I was like, see, like as a prior, like they if I can do it, they can do it. Like I was
Yep.
almost like a woman who's like an anti-feminist who's like, see where I got to, like there's no such thing as
Oh.
patriarchy. And
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of like that. And then I realized I'm like, I'm not helping. I was actually just riddled with my own insecurity of
Mm.
like pushing other people down so I could
Yes.
stand on their shoulders essentially.
Yeah.
And um it also like I respond really well to exercise. It's
Mm-hmm.
truly like I was 14 and I had muscular arms because I was doing pull-ups all the time. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I've trained people who trained way hard. Like I've had clients I've trained for years. And I'm like, I remember one time I had this client who she wouldn't have been, people wouldn't look at her as someone who's quote unquote in shape. And I remember I was
Yeah.
working with her for years and I was like, I've literally never trained as hard as that woman does ever. Like
Yep.
absolute grinder in the gym. And
Mm-hmm.
the results, the tangible physical results weren't there. And I think a
Right.
lot of people, you tell them that they might get a little demoralized, but it is liberating in a sense too, because you're not just like a hack away. You're not following this person's program away. It's not a moral failing to not train for 10 years and end up looking like like a fitness model.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I think that you can see that sort of like, yeah, kind of socio-political landscape of the fitness industry in the ongoing debate of, is obesity a choice?
Oh no.
What,
Oh
like
my
I
God, I get
just,
so mad.
I'm like, okay, but why do we even have, why do we need an answer to this question, whether or not it's a choice? It's like we want to be able to say it is, so we can say it's your fault. We
Yeah.
want to be able to say it's absolutely not, so we can say it's not your fault. Both of those imply that there's something wrong. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry that you have obesity. It's not your fault, or it's definitely your fault. It that is does not, it's so like does not matter
Yeah.
at all. It's like, okay, whether or not it's a choice, because that's irrelevant. Does this person want to have access to resources that will help them support their health and well being? That's the question. Okay. And then how do we help them achieve that?
Yeah.
Like it just doesn't matter, but people want to be able to say it's a choice or not, but mostly it's a choice. So they can, yeah, they can like point fingers. And the fact that you acknowledge like your own insecurities, I mean, that's amazing. Like props to you for that, because
Oh,
I
thank you.
don't think like people don't even realize maybe that it's just their internalized own like self hatred and disdain that they are pouring out onto other people when they do that.
I think big time, like a big part of that is especially when I was like really in it, seeing a fatter person happy would piss me off. Cause I'd be like,
Ah.
I could never be happy when I was big. Like
Yep.
because I had such massive insecurities about my body
Hmm.
that, and this
Hmm.
transcends actually body size. I've done this when I was younger in other areas too, where like
Yeah.
in this like in a psychological manner, when someone can set boundaries, that always would bother me back in the day because I'd be like, who the fuck do you think you are? Like
Yes.
I was working at a gym, my first gym I worked at when I moved to Toronto, and it was like I would start at
Hmm.
5 a.m. and I would finish at 9 p.m. And
Oof.
I was just like, because I got to do whatever it takes to get ahead. And here's the
Hmm.
thing, it worked. I did get ahead pretty quickly, but I burnt
Sure. Yeah.
myself out. And I had a
Yeah.
colleague who was a friend of mine. And I remember she's like, I don't start till 10. And I remember being like, who the fuck do you think you are? And like,
Yeah.
and then I was like, but one day I was like, I think I'm just jealous that like, I think that if I do that, my shit will fall apart. And
Yes.
she's living proof that her business is doing okay. She's having a
Mhm.
life that she enjoys. She's living a life that she likes. I'm projecting my own anger at myself for not being able to set a boundary onto her. And I think people do
Yes.
that with diet too, where it's like if
Mhm.
someone is in a bigger body and you're just strangled by this relentless pursuit for thinness because you think that's will make you happy, when you see someone's existence actually challenging your strong internal beliefs, like tangibly to your face. Like they
Mhm.
are happy, and you're like, well, you want to lose weight, right? And they're like, no, not really. And they're like you're out with them and they're having a burger. And you're like, oh, this is a cheat
Mhm.
day, right? And they're like, no, this is dinner. And
Mhm.
it's so easy because you also, to your point, you mentioned you have societal backing to then be like,
Yeah.
see, like she's or he or they're obese and then they're ordering a burger and they don't even care. See, like they're making that choice. Like, I just don't want them to die. I care about their health. And it's
Oh,
like, no,
right.
you're mad that they actually just enjoyed a whole burger and they're gonna forget
Mhm.
they had that tomorrow. And if you
Yes.
did that, you're gonna literally like it's gonna dominate your psyche for 24 hours.
Oh my
And
God.
really
Yeah.
it's just a projection of that like jealousy in a way.
Yeah. It's the how dare you.
Yeah. How dare you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And oh man, this is so great. So many points that you're bringing up. I'm thinking of like conversations that I have had with people where unknowingly they are showing their internalized weight bias, their fat phobia, their judgment of others just through little statements like that. Like, oh, I get like that person just doesn't seem to care, you know? And it's like, a person can care about their health and well-being and also eat food that they enjoy
Mm,
and then move on about their day. Like the fact that you are like the fact that you are suffering by your own hand because you haven't worked through all of the things that have kept you stuck in this cycle doesn't mean that you care more than this other person. But
yeah,
that's the
100%.
other, it's like the other belief that I see so much. It's like the obesity is a choice or not. Well, then the next step is okay, well then that person must not care because they're making poor choices or they're not even thinking about the choice that they're making. And it is just showing that yeah, like so many people are struggling to maintain a specific physique because they don't feel comfortable with themselves. And it's so confronting to see another person who doesn't fit society's ideal, beauty ideal, and they are comfortable with themselves. And it's like, how dare they, and how are they doing that? You're like,
Mm.
that's not fair.
Yeah, if you don't take a step back and think about it, it doesn't feel fair because
Right.
you just look at your own suffering and you think that the
Mhm.
relief of that suffering would be to achieve a certain outcome, and then you see someone
Right.
not strangled by that suffering and
Mhm.
happy, like they've to your point to bring it back, they've cut out the middleman,
Yes,
and in
exactly.
your life the middleman is literally the governor, and
Yeah.
you feel oppressed by that like
Mhm.
internal belief system, and it like when any human feels oppressed we tend to act crazy, like we lose it because
Yes.
that internal feeling of injustice is
Mhm.
blood boiling, and
Oh
you
my
you
God.
kind
Yeah.
of have no one to take it out on. But unfortunately, how society works, you can always take it out on someone who's more marginalized than you, and you'll
Yes.
probably get support for that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that was like, in a very real sense, propaganda was created in the early 1900s to point to people in large bodies and say they're hoarding food, they're
Yeah.
bad Americans.
Yeah,
So,
it
like,
was I remember it was a Protestant thing too. Like the Protestant work ethic was like all about
yep,
discipline and like restraint and having like personal
Hmm.
austerity. And I do know
Yeah.
it actually related to a lot of racist kind of beliefs too, of
Hmm.
pointing to like Africans as being like gluttonous, like because like I remember that book Fearing the Black Body. Did you ever read that
Hmm.
by Sabrina
Yep.
Strings?
Yep.
And I
Yep.
remember the passages she pulled up from that for some of the European colonizers was like them seeing Africans just having a good ass time, like
Right.
eating food, not caring, having sex,
Hmm.
not having a fun time like humans like to do. And then they were
Yep.
living these highly restrictive Puritan lifestyles. And
Yeah.
instead, it actually ties in perfectly where they're like, how if I were to do that, I would feel so much shame for
Yes.
everything. You know what? It's and then you basically create like a racist ideology out of it. And you're like,
Hmm.
see, they're actually the problem. When really the
Right.
problem was I because I have interpreted some sort of belief system to such a dogmatic belief or a
Hmm.
degree. If I were to do that, I would genuinely feel like I'm going to hell. To see you
Yeah.
do that in a balanced way and just enjoy it makes my blood boil so much that
Hmm.
we know what happens next in some degree, but it is
Yeah.
truly like it feeds right into that same feeling. I remember reading those passages being like, yo, these Europeans are jealous, like straight up. Like
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. There are, so that one, and then Modern Food, Moral Food, Paradox of Plenty, and Calories and Corsets are books I would recommend if people are interested in like the history of beauty, modern beauty ideals and standards, and like the craze of dieting. Um, because like it really was part of like the socio-political landscape that we had food conservation propaganda, and where that came from was actually advancements in nutritional science, because that was around the time when Ansel Keys characterized the calorie, and people, the US populace understood then the concept of energy balance, and oh, the food that we eat can be stored in our bodies. And so if you're eating more food than you need, you will have a larger body. And if you're doing that, you're not conserving food. You're not making sure that we're sending it to the allies, and that makes you a bad person.
oh, I actually didn't know
Yes.
there was some
Yep.
sort of like war narrative with that because I knew
Yep.
Ansel
Yep.
Keys, he did the Seven Heart Study. Like he's
Yeah.
obviously a very like um I guess, volatile figure, depending on
Yeah.
whatever you're like. If you
Who you
believe
talk
that,
to? Yeah.
yeah, if you believe that saturated fat has a relationship with heart disease, which it does.
Mhm.
If you don't believe that, he's like the devil, apparently. Like
Yes.
I've just known him to be, people just love debating that guy. I'm like, that guy's been
Yeah.
dead for like 50 years. I think,
Right. Exactly. He
I don't
doesn't
think
care.
he cares.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, yeah, you could kind of consider he's like the grandfather of calorie counting. And
Yeah.
within just a few years, the first diet books were published, and they promoted actually having kind of, quote unquote cheat meals. I mean, that's been around for
Oh,
100
really?
years. Yes, yeah, it was basically the author, whose name I can't remember right now, but she basically said, when you've been dieting so hard and so long that you can't take it anymore, have a debauch, which is essentially you eat as much as of whatever you want. And then you go back to strict dieting the next day. But I was like, oh my gosh, this has been part of this damaging cycle since the very beginning.
I want to see the
Um,
Victorian era mukbangs.
they also used to have Fletcherization, which I'm sure will make a comeback, but it's chewing your food until it's completely liquid, and it just kind of is like gliding down the back of your throat, like, and that's supposed to be, better for you. So yeah, fad diets and strange behaviors in the interest of weight loss have been part of U.S. society for over 100 years now, and a lot of the beliefs are the same. I mean, part of the other part of the movement was um, part of the idea of advancing, like counting calories and counting macros was a form of being more refined and more advanced and knowledgeable. And if you weren't doing that, then you weren't feeding your family properly. Like, even if you were feeding them the same meals as someone else who was counting their calories and macros, you weren't feeding your family properly. And they have quotes from people that wrote into magazines saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I was feeding my family before I knew about calories. Like, they just, I wasn't putting calories in the food. So there's like this
Yeah.
this misunderstanding of how it even works, but just a
Wait, they
widespread.
thought they weren't putting calories in the food?
Yeah, yeah, they thought that the food didn't count if they weren't counting the calories. So and that persisted even through the Great Depression, in part because the higher socioeconomic levels weren't as impacted by the depression.
Yeah.
And And much like the way that we exercise now to have a muscular physique, whereas people who are marginalized and work laborious jobs and whatnot have a muscular physique because they have to work, it was similar back then, that it was sort of posh to have a lean body that made it look like you were scrimping. It made it look like you were,
Oh.
engaging in food conservation. And so that thin ideal persisted through the Great Depression, even though it really shouldn't have, based on historical patterns where like a larger body was seen as more prosperous and generally like more attractive.
Yeah, I remember that,
And it's, yeah.
like way back in the day, and that switch.
Yep. Yep.
That actually like that runs parallel with a lot of like colorism beliefs. Like, because my family's
Yes.
Indian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm half, like a mix, but my Indian side of the family was there's so much colorism in parts of Asia, and some of it
Yeah.
was related to like if you were darker skinned, you were working in the fields,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was like if you could be as fair as possible, it was considered like a regal status. So similar
Right.
to what you're talking about, if you were muscular and bigger, they'd be like, oh well, that person is a laborer. But if you're
Right.
really thin and like almost underfed, it's like that's the
Mm-hmm.
status of like, well, that person
Yeah.
clearly has everyone doing their labor for them because they can afford to do
Exactly.
so.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it persists. It changes a little bit. Like the feminine ideal has become, being more muscular, still very lean and defined, not too muscular, but that's become a little bit more popular. But still, when you look at like being tan, now being tan is part of looking fit,
Yeah.
even though in other parts of the world and in other periods in history, being tan, like you mentioned, was a sign of being in a lower socioeconomic
Mm.
status. So it is really interesting to see the parallels and like what's carried over and how it shifts. But at the core of it is still this attachment to a person, the moral attachment that we apply to a person's appearance and the way that they eat. That like we assume that a person has more self-discipline and so on. We make all these character judgments about a person based on the way that they look and the way that they eat. And so when someone is in a body size that's just however they are based on the life that they're living, and they're living their best life and they're not counting macros, people who are striving and, like you said, being strangled are looking at that and thinking that's all wrong. Like they're uncivilized, they're not doing things the right way because this is, society standards are actually that you should look this way and you should be counting macros. That's the more rational way of existing.
It's funny you say that because I think too often people forget that these beliefs come from somewhere, and like the beliefs, because I think when you don't stop, especially if you are internalizing and then communicating the larger macro beliefs that have kind of been passed down to you indirectly without you kind of
Mm-hmm.
knowing it, it
Yeah.
feels like you're just observing a natural phenomenon,
Yes.
but you're actually unaware of and propaganda is the perfect term for it because it's
Mm-hmm.
intentional, right?
Yep.
And I think people think of propaganda as inherently being a bad thing, but
Right.
I internalize it as more of like it's an intentional like
Mm-hmm.
communication from a larger institution. And that can
Right.
be like there can be some positive ones, like, and even if it's not inherently like you're not being completely truthful, you're trying to make it simple enough that the population can digest it and then believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you can really do that with negative things. So you can run horrible propaganda very effectively. But I
Mm-hmm.
mean, even for example, I don't know if I want to call it that, but like 8 glasses of water a day. Like everyone
Right.
knows that. You could almost
Mm-hmm.
argue there's some level of propaganda there because like not everyone needs different variation amounts of water.
Right.
But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
everyone knows 8 glasses of water, which means you should drink more water, which most people
Mm-hmm.
should. So positive
Yeah.
propaganda, you could kind of call it that. But people
Mm-hmm.
think naturally, well, everyone has to drink 8 glasses of water a day. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, where do you think that came from? That obviously came from somewhere.
Right.
And the job of this world that I always feel so much like I I feel so much empathy for them is communications on a large scale.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
I think the pandemic really highlighted that for me. I'm
Oof.
like, listen, they dropped the bag. I don't even imagine what doing a good job of that would be. I
Yeah.
can't even imagine. So like, you know what?
Yeah.
They did annoying things, whatever, like larger institutions, but I can't even imagine what a good job would have been there. And it's like
Right.
that came from somewhere. And if they
Yeah.
said make it this large scale of, you know, have 4 to 12 depending on body size and depending on activity level and the climate that you're in, etc. People are gonna be like, okay, like that. This is so confusing. First you're saying four, then you're
Right.
saying six. But if you just give a rigid eight, you're like, okay, cool, right? And you believe.
Exactly.
But the way
Yep.
we believe about bodies and health and the interlinking of the two comes from somewhere. And
Right.
in the West, Canada, America, and a lot of countries, like that was rooted in a lot of like colonial history. It was rooted, a lot of it
Mhm.
was rooted in white supremacy. It was rooted in
Yeah.
patriarchy. It was rooted in all of these systems that were here
Oh my
that
gosh, yes.
they're not, the systems aren't gone. They're just slowly being like challenged over time. And it takes a really long time,
Hmm.
unfortunately. But they do come from there. And then when you realize it, you're like, oh,
Right.
shit. Like, it doesn't mean that body like adiposity has no relation health. No one credible is saying that, I don't think.
Exactly.
But
Yes.
it is worth taking a step back and being like, well, where do these ideas come from? How true are they? And you know what
Yeah.
is actually worth spending time on?
Right, exactly. And I love that you brought up the point that people are unaware and they think it's just a natural thing because they have forgotten, the point at which they learned it because it is gradual. I think that's the other thing about propaganda is that you don't necessarily believe it, take it at face value the first time that you hear it. But when you have so many people who are saying it and it's repeated to you so many times and so many people around you believe it and behave based on that belief, then it's like, oh, this must be the way of things. But what I think is really ironic, and I'll speak from as a cis het woman to other people who identify as women or have had a woman experience, that there is so much of the fitness industry and intentional weight loss is based in the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most impactful quotes that I read, and I already knew this was the case, but this was from one of the books way back in the early 1900s, is like, as a woman's age increases, her value decreases. And so
Andrew Tate.
women, oh God, oh, it's not even over. The last 100 years, oh
I was like,
God,
that's not from. I heard that on Twitter before I got on
last
this
week.
call. So I don't know. I don't know if that's from the
Oh
90s.
God, seriously. Ugh. But it's like, but I mean, that's such a great point because it is still here. Those beliefs are still here. And women are trying to shrink themselves based on those beliefs, even though I think that if you showed that to a woman and say, hey, this is like the woman who wrote the first diet book thought that if you were larger, you were worth less as a woman. And so this is all about making you more attractive to men so that you'll get married off, so that you won't be a widow. And I think if you were to show people that, if that was like part of the, if that could be a propaganda,
Yeah.
I think people would maybe start reconsidering how worthwhile it is to continue to pursue this specific physique. Because like, what's your why behind it? If you think that you need to look a certain way to be valued, respected, loved, find a partner, to be heard, that's not a you problem. It's just that you have internalized this belief. But like, A, it's not true. And B, you're gonna be disappointed when you find out that it's not true. Like,
Yeah.
and it sucks to realize that to some extent that's so out of our control. Because like you mentioned earlier, it feels like a very easy fix. It's like, oh, well, I know that I'll be happier or I'll feel more in control of my life. Like, I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with a client who's like, my life is spiraling out of control. Can you give me like more strict macros?
Yeah.
Because
Oh my God. I hear that all. It's like the last thing
yes,
you need right now is more
yes,
stress and more rigidity.
exactly, exactly. But it's like they want a sense of agency because when you feel like your value is contingent on other people's perceptions of you, when you think like, I need to look a certain way, I need to act a certain way, I need to speak a certain way in order to be accepted by society because that's how I stay safe, then yeah, of course, when the stuff is hitting the fan, you're like, oh, okay, now's the time for me to pursue my leanest possible physique because people will like me then and I won't be at risk. But the reality is, when I'm like, as I'm working with clients who are unpacking all of this, they usually start to realize, oh, I actually wasn't advocating for myself. I wasn't setting boundaries. I wasn't paying attention to my true needs and values. I didn't even know what they were. I just thought that if I was smaller, that would fix my problems.
Yeah.
But actually, like the call's coming from inside the house. It actually is that I need to actually change things in my life, not just my physical appearance. I need to change the way that I show up in my life. But it's almost like they think that their appearance has to change first before it's safe for them to speak up and set boundaries.
Yeah.
And it just, that will keep you stuck forever, because when you're trying to use your physical appearance to feel safe, that safety is still not coming from yourself. You have to learn how to help yourself feel safe. And then it's not going to matter like what you're wearing or what your body looks like. You are going to know, I deserve to advocate for myself. It is safe for me to do so. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then like watch how much more time you have, because you're not at the gym from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m.
Yeah. 100%. So
Yeah.
I just realized it's 3, and you and I
Oh
could
my gosh.
probably ramble about this forever. Like this could just be a conversation. So I actually want to ask about the coaching stuff now, because I think we've talked
Yes.
about how someone ends up here. I think the one reflection I had when we were talking is we gave 2 options kind of at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's like you could just try to lose 10 more pounds and double down, or you
Mhm.
could go into a journey that's basically encapsulates everything we just talked about. And
Yes.
that's the uphill battle, is like it's
Right.
so much easier to lean into, all right, you know what,
Mhm.
another diet. We're basically characters from Men in Black who can hit that little button, forget about all the past failures of dieting, and think this time will be different. Like we
Oh,
really
yeah.
do have this relentless reserve of like, this time will be different when it comes to
Oof.
dieting. Like we have
Mm-hmm.
amnesia when it comes to dieting
Yes.
and weight loss
Yeah.
pursuit.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you are work, because I assume you work with clients who are kind of have at least nudged to the other option of like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to do this. I kind of want to do it again, but I know I don't want to. So
Yeah.
what are like some biggest, if someone's like, say they're in this cycle, what are
Mm-hmm.
some ways that you help someone get out of it, and kind of strategies that people can use to at least nudge themselves there? Because it's a long journey. I know it's not a simple answer,
Yes.
but I want to
Yeah.
pick your
Yeah.
brain on that.
Well, the way that you pointed out that we have amnesia, like this time will be different, that we see that in relationships too. Like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like, I will own up to that. I have been in that cycle. And it's because the relationship that we have with ourselves shows up in the relationships that we have with other people, that we have with exercise, that we have with food. So my work is really on a person's relationship with themselves. And when I start working with a client who's in that space of ambivalence, which just basically means it's a very human experience, being undecided and feeling kind of conflicted. There's friction between where you are now and where you want to be, because there's so much safety and a sense of security attached to macro tracking. So the first steps are to help that person feel more ready to take the next step. And it's not to just like throw them into the deep end of the pool. It's to have a conversation about the pros and cons of either making the change, like not counting macros anymore, or not making the change, continuing to count macros. And it's really has to be that own person's readiness and commitment to change that has to come out during that conversation. And that's why I've done so much training in motivational interviewing, because that is a way of having a safe conversation about the possibility of change. So I'm not trying to get this person to change. I have my boundaries. And I know that if a person comes to me with a history of disordered eating and they say, I want you to help me use macros to lose weight one more time, I'm going to say, I'm not the right coach for you. If that's their ultimate decision. So I have no attachment to the decision that they make. I'm just there to help them make one. When they usually inevitably make the decision, okay, I don't want to count macros anymore, then the next step is, what is, well, the reasonable next step for you? What
One
feels
second.
like,
So, can I cut you? I have a question about that.
sure.
Do you think that when they come to you, because when they know you, I assume they know
Mm-hmm.
you're probably not going to offer them that.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks that they want to be told that it's okay not to track.
Oh, absolutely. I think it helps them to hear from someone else. You don't have to track if you
Yeah.
don't want to, and that's part of like the self-efficacy of even just like a vicarious experience. Like I tell them, I don't track. And no, that's not necessarily to say like, I don't track and look at me, I look great. It's, I don't track. And also I don't have a strong attachment to the way that I look. And if you are judging me based on how I look, then you're probably not the right client for me. Like,
Yeah.
and that's okay. but it's about having that, like building that rapport. And yeah, usually people know what they're going to get from me. And
Yeah.
that being said, I mean, when I was with RP, I was coming from a place of being a macros coach, and I ended up interacting with a lot more clients that felt very conflicted. And I even felt very conflicted because I didn't know my boundaries yet at the time. And I didn't feel safe in myself to say, I don't want to coach um, intentional weight loss, or I should say, I don't want to coach cosmetic weight loss.
Yeah.
There are, like I mentioned, with a strength athlete in some cases, but I don't want to coach cosmetic weight loss. It is totally someone's prerogative if they want to pursue cosmetic weight loss. You're an adult, you have bodily autonomy. If you want to get a bunch of like dermal implants, cut your tongue in half, shave your head, all of those things, well, maybe not shaving your head, but all those things come with potential risk. Tattoos, I have several. You're a grown adult and you can do that. But there are things that I would not facilitate a person doing because I view that as contributing to potential harm. And it's just not something that fulfills me. Like, I get so much more joy and fulfillment out of helping that person feel ready to move away from this cycle where they've been feeling stuck for years,
Mhm.
and to start learning about themselves more, appreciating and respecting themselves more, setting boundaries, showing up differently in their lives. Like, and it usually, like the nutrition, like the not tracking macros anymore, is the gateway drug to actually taking charge of the rest of your life, because macros are you feeling like you're in control of like the small aspect of your life that you are in control of. But when you can liberate yourself from that set of beliefs, and know, like, oh, I actually don't have to track macros. Like, I don't care if someone cares that I don't track macros. I don't need to. That's incredibly liberating. And then you start to unravel all of those, and I should say remove, separate those internalized beliefs and internalized values from a society and other people, and identify what yours actually are.
Yeah.
Because, like, to say, oh, I value health and that's why I want to look a certain way. But really, do you have to look a certain way to achieve physical health? Actually, not really.
There's one like there's an intersection of a population that I've actually believed in my years of coaching. This isn't obviously across the board, of people
Yeah.
who, when they say they just want to be healthier,
Mm-hmm.
I almost believe them, like regardless of weight loss. And it's
Yeah.
like older dudes who've had a health scare. I don't know
Yes.
why, because I've worked with a lot of people. Because whenever someone says like, I want to lose weight for health reasons,
Mm-hmm.
like,
Yeah.
okay, because obviously like that can lead to like better metabolic health markers, right?
Yeah.
But then I'll say, okay, what if you're the doctor and you lose 0 pounds, but your A1C goes down, your LDL goes down, all these metabolic
Mm-hmm.
markers, like how will you feel?
Yep.
A lot of
Yep.
the time, most people will be like, yeah, yeah, okay, I just want to lose weight. I'm like, okay, cool. I want to know
Mm-hmm.
where we are, right?
Right.
But in my experience, like older men who've had a health scare are like, yeah, I actually don't care. Like I got a beer belly, couldn't care less. I just don't want to die.
Yep.
And it's usually a
Yes.
health scare because I worked at a gym I don't know, do you know Toronto well?
Uh-uh.
Okay, so we have a thing called Bay Street, which is basically the Wall Street of Canada. So it's the
Okay.
financial hub of Canada, and it's
Oh,
like
wow.
so there's a lot of like execs work there. So I train a lot of
Mm-hmm.
like older executives, and like they wouldn't be in the best shape. They would have high
Mm-hmm.
body fats, etc. And a lot of the guys would come in like, I don't want to. I want to change as minimal as possible. I don't care
Yep.
about losing weight. I just want to be healthier. And I was like, I actually believe you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Most of the time, when someone says I want to lose weight for health reasons, it usually comes with, and I think now as people have seen the challenge of like, and I like the challenge of like challenging the idea of like weight loss is always good. So I think people know how to
Right.
package it a little better. Like,
Yes.
I know I don't really care about how I look. I just want to lose weight so I can be healthier. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's more of a coded way of saying like, I just want to fucking be lean. And I know
Yeah.
it's more right now, it's a little bit more socially acceptable to package that in a health pursuing perspective. And
Yes.
I do notice that that comes back because a lot of people will say that. And I mean, I'm also still stuck with that too. Like I
Yeah.
still have to fight that internal idea. And I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when people listen to this conversation, then I think like, oh, Dylan and Gabby have worked through. I'm like, I haven't worked through it completely. Like
Yeah.
the voices will always be there. It just,
Mm-hmm.
I've interpreted as like, how much attention do I give them and how much
Right.
do I trust those voices? Like, I think on
Mm-hmm.
a previous podcast, I used the analogy of like, they're like drunk, annoying uncles. Like
Yes.
every time you see them, they always got something to say. They're always like
Mm-hmm.
critiquing everyone else in the room, but they've
Yep.
never changed. And their advice I've taken and it never helped. But
Right.
they're going to keep yapping. And I just kind of like,
Yes.
I'm at the point now where I can tune them out. Sometimes they can say the thing that gets me triggered, though,
For
right?
sure.
And that's
Yeah,
kind of like where
absolutely.
that's really what progress looks like. It doesn't look like complete divestment from, I don't
Yes.
care at all how I look. If I gained 400 pounds today, I wouldn't. I'm like, no, like it's not realistic to talk about that.
Right.
It's not a purity test. It is just,
Mm-hmm.
are these beliefs holding yourself back? And I think for the most case, they are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that people don't really understand, I think, about weight neutral coaching is that it's not anti weight change. You're not
Yeah.
like trying to get this person to maintain their weight. It's just that weight is not an outcome that you're measuring. You're just not tracking it. You're like, and the thing is, the process can look exactly the same minus weighing in. And what usually happens is that the person just has less psychological distress and can even have better adherence because they're not on this like emotional roller coaster. And of course, there is utility to being able to step on the scale and be like, I guess that's what that is today, and just using it as a piece of information. But like, we don't have to do that. Like the scale weight, especially just like from one day to the next, is not an indicator of health. It is okay. Your scale weight's one thing, but what is your, yeah, like you mentioned, A1C, cholesterol levels, blood pressure, and if those are the things that we want to change, why are we just measuring weight change?
Yeah.
Why don't we, and why are we just doing calorie deficit? Why don't we look at things that can also improve those, like exercise, just like physical activity and stress relief practices. And if a person does want to lose weight for cosmetic reasons, like I mentioned, it is totally up to them. I mean, that's your body. And I think Eric Helms does a great job of describing this, from a physique competitor standpoint. For some people, it really is just an enjoyable form of body modification. It's like getting tattoos or piercings or whatever. There is still a huge risk because of health and mental, health risk. But like some people are just like, oh yeah, I just like the way that my body looks like when it's like this. And then when it doesn't look like this, that's fine too. But I think that's a very, very small
Yeah.
percent of the population.
Well,
And most people
Eric
aren't.
is an outlier. Like
He
is
really
he's truly like one of the healthiest,
yes.
like from a mindset perspective, one of the most
Mm-hmm.
well-rounded and healthy, like
Yes.
like bodybuilding competitors I've ever seen. Like I'm just like,
Right.
what?
I have told him he's like a moral compass for the industry.
He
Like,
truly is. And he's
you
like,
know,
and he's at the center of like the id of toxic shit too. Like
yes.
bodybuilding in particular
Mm-hmm.
really is like so many of our beliefs rain down from there right
Oh
now.
yeah.
And like
Yeah.
people forget that it's a sport too. I find often I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, they're gonna
Yep.
do wild stuff for sport. Like
Right.
me and you, we're just lifting. Like I'm just trying to be
Yes.
healthier. But no,
Yeah. And that
he
was
is wild.
no, he's fantastic. And I mean, he had me on the Iron Culture podcast. I would say he was one of like the earliest people who understood what I was talking about for one thing, and then wanted to have productive conversations about it. And and I think it was, because like he was talking about the same stuff. I just was not in the bodybuilding world, but I wanted to have that conversation in like the recreational fitness world because the other impetus for making a change was that I was noticing, a lot of these macro programs, a lot of macro coaching it's made for bodybuilders, but it is sold to like soccer moms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It's
you know,
actually, if you take a step, if an alien came down and saw that, they'd be like, what the hell are you guys doing?
yes, yeah. And I mean to see some of these being marketed to like nursing moms and like, postnatal and I'm like I, oh wow, like that's your first focus. And I think that it is a little bit predatory
Yeah.
to create, especially these like very strict macro based plans. Like this woman and her partner, like these people are so sleep deprived. you're going to give them all of this math to do, like
Yeah.
if you want to provide some helpful structure, could you maybe make it just more like visual, like plate planning or something?
Yeah.
And it's just like this level of granularity that is not necessary, but people begin to think that's the default, and doing anything less than that is like lazy or not committed, or it's just a break from doing that. And that's another thing that I think is so important to address, that like what I do is not to just say, oh, I'm going to fix your relationship with food and your body image so you can go back to dieting again. Sure, if someone
Yes.
wants to do that, okay, but like that's not the purpose. The purpose of this journey is to completely help you release yourself from that, so that it's not even a thing you're like, ooh, actually, that sucked. I don't want to do that again. I have so many other things that I'm focused on now.
So when you were talking about how you apply your coaching, the image in my mind is like you almost hold up a mirror, but it's not a straight mirror. It's one of those mirrors with like 10 different angles, because you're kind of showing like, hey, here's a relationship with you, and here's how it affects
Mm-hmm.
your diet. Here's how it affects your personal relationships, your work boundaries, your family relationships, like it kind of does trickle far out. Now,
Yeah,
someone
yeah,
needs to be really
exactly.
ready to take a deep look if they want to pursue
Mm-hmm.
that, because that
Yeah.
could be real scary. Like sometimes a
Yes.
mirror is the most terrifying place on the planet for us.
Oh, for sure.
And we need
Yeah.
to be ready to look at it in a metaphorical
Yes.
sense, of course.
1,000%. And that's why, like, I always recommend that people are working with a mental health professional. I'm not, maybe one day I would love to be a therapist eventually. I've got, things in the works, but like, while working with me, because there are things that a person could bring up in a coaching call, like they're about to bring up some like family trauma that is so valuable. And also that's going to be outside of my scope.
Yeah.
And so it's so beneficial to have that synergistic relationship, because the therapist may not be as well versed in like ways to implement, physical activity and fueling recommendations, in a weight neutral way, but they can help with some of the sources of these beliefs, these like deep set beliefs. But it is absolutely can be very confronting for people. And the way that you said holding up a mirror is a beautiful way to visualize like what the conversation looks like, because the most powerful statements that you can make to a person are actually just reflections of what a person has said to you, just giving it back to them with like a little bit of what was between the lines, or some of the, and empathy to say
Mm.
like, oh, I see you and I understand where you're coming from. That must feel like X, Y, and Z. Or, oh, you did this because you have this belief or because you value this thing. And they're like, oh my gosh, yes. And
So
so you're
what you're
just
saying is
yeah,
the best way is to actually reflect it right back to them. Like,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah, which I just did right now, which is
exactly.
very impressive.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, no, and people, I think people are apprehensive to do that because they're like, well, but I need to be asking all the right questions or giving them information. But actually, when you provide an accurate, empathetic reflection, a person will share with you again. That's an invitation, because they're
yeah.
like, oh, you get it, you get it. This is a safe space. And then you help them to discover all these things about themselves that have just been dormant or haven't been examined because they've been looking at one thing, like this must be the solution to my problems. So I try to set the stage for that in the very beginning, like with the first conversation. It is not to create a plan for change. It is to build trust and respect and positive regard. And then the next steps are a values identification activity. And it actually, like what you had mentioned, I can't remember exactly how you said it, but it's basically to invite them to look at, what they think they value and how it shows up in their lives,
Mm.
and what values are actually showing up versus what values are not showing up. And then what are they doing and how are they feeling when those values are showing up versus not. And it starts to help them think about the ways that they're showing up in their lives, in like when they feel really aligned and like authentic, and then when they don't, and then to start identifying, why am I showing up in these ways that don't feel aligned? Like, why am I forcing myself to do that? And how can I do more of the things that feel authentic and help me actually feel a deep sense of safety and security and appreciation and respect for myself that is not reliant on other people?
The thing that stuck out to me there when you were talking about that is I'm imagining someone coming to you for coaching because a lot of the time when someone actually makes a decision to seek help, in the immediate sense, they're looking for relief
Yeah.
because they have these feelings that they can't tolerate anymore that
Hmm.
is then actually driving action. Like if you don't have those
Yeah.
feelings, it's pretty hard to drive action. Like we need some sort of push. And
Hmm.
one of the things I think the fitness industry does a really poor job of historically is when someone, oh, I feel fat. I'm like, okay, well, here's your macros. And the moment you receive those macros, because I know this as a
Hmm.
client when I was like younger, I did this. I'm like, I received that template of what I'm like,
Hmm.
all right, here we go. Here's day one of the
Yes.
rest of my life. Like I get that immediate pressure
Yes.
relief, right?
Yep.
But when you get that immediate pressure relief, it often is a little bit um it's a little bit of a bag of I don't know the word I'm trying to use. It's a bit of a myth because you're like,
Yeah.
oh, it's you're getting a false sense of like, oh my God, I just did something. That's why
Right.
sometimes like shopping can be so like shopping online can be so therapeutic for a second because like I
Uh-huh.
felt bad, I did something and I feel better now. It
Yeah.
actually just kind of it's like taking a Tylenol for your uncomfortable feelings. Like it'll come back. You
Yes.
didn't actually cure anything. And
Hmm.
when it comes to someone applying for coaching, very much someone is often going to be looking for an immediate relief. Okay, I have a sense of control again. I've done
Yeah.
something. And if it's you can really hit that pain point if you attach it to like weight loss, like, oh my God, I knew I
Oof.
needed to lose weight. Ooh, I feel so
Hmm.
good. Your
Yep.
first like consultation, it sounds like, is going to provide none of that. Like there's no
No.
immediate relief. It's like, okay, like we need to actually like investigate. We actually need to take the time to figure
Yes.
out what are your values. Like that's an uncomfortable question. That's not an
Yeah.
exciting question, to be honest.
Right.
Because, and I know that
Oh
from my
yeah.
own personal experience, like it's confronting because you're like,
Hmm.
I don't fucking know. And then you almost have a little bit of a sunk cost fallacy with your own life where you're like, have I been actually living out of the line with my values for like 10 years? Like,
Oh yeah.
that feels like I've wasted a fucking decade. Like,
Hmm.
nope,
Hmm.
that can't be true. Like, it's very easy in that sense to be like, no, no, no. Gabrielle is just, she's all mindset. She's kind of woo woo. Like, I just wanted to like
Yes.
train and like, she just wanted to like have me be a healthier, more rounded person. Like,
Hmm.
that's not really for me, Like, that's
Oh,
a
for
tough
sure.
bridge to gap. And there's a lot of readiness that goes
Yes.
into that.
Yeah. I think that there is a Venn diagram of people and I don't mean this in a judgmental way. Many people do this. I have done this in the past, but people who try to meet all of their needs with food
Mm,
and people who try to meet all of their needs with weight loss.
yeah.
There's quite a lot of overlap. And
It's a
part
circle.
of yes, exactly, it's a circle because if yes, because if you are thinking that food is the problem, then weight loss is the solution. And in both cases you
Yeah.
are trying to meet too many needs with something that is not going to appropriately meet them. Like yes, you'll get, I love that you point out like that short-term relief, you will get short-term relief from eating something enjoyable in the same way that you'll get short-term relief from starting a new macro plan.
Yeah.
But give it some time, and those difficult emotions, that emotional, mental, philosophical need is still going to be there when you're done with the food or you're done with the macro plan or even at the end of that diet. You still have other needs that you haven't really learned how to meet. And so when and I this doesn't mean that it's going to lead to weight loss, but when a person has a better ability to identify their actual internal sensations and their actual needs, they have an easier time than regulating their food intake because
Yeah.
they can identify, oh, I'm anxious or I'm bored or I'm lonely, but I'm not physically hungry. I just ate a few hours ago. Even though I want to eat this thing, and I could, I know that actually I'm not going to feel good after I do that. And so instead, I'm going to do this other thing that's going to help me feel better. And
Yeah.
even when they want to eat something for enjoyment, they eat at a comfortable amount of it. And I say this as a person, I used to have to freeze my peanut butter because if it wasn't frozen, I would binge on it because it
Oh
was
yeah.
like, off limits food. Now I'll have like multiple jars of peanut butter because it's for me a sensory thing. Once I get to the bottom and it's a little too hard, I can't can't eat it, but I don't want to throw it out. But
You've always
so
had a complicated relationship with peanut butter.
yes, yes,
is
just
what you're
much healthier
saying.
now. But like, or the one that I always use is Reese's cups because I was the same way. Like I couldn't have Reese's cups in the house because I would eat, a bag of Reese's cups, I would eat all of them. And I got to a place where I was like, actually, it does not feel good. My my it's strange as this sounds, my mouth enjoys this,
Mm.
but the rest of my body does not. So I'm going to listen more to the rest of my body and say, mouth, we can have more later, but right now I just want to have one or
Yeah.
two and then move on.
It's like the reverse of that. My mind's telling me no, but my body's telling me yes.
Yeah.
It's like my mouth is
Exactly.
telling me yes, but my mind is telling me no. It,
Right, right.
I've always described it as like when you gain a level of consciousness about this stuff, it's almost like the drug stopped working. And it's super
Yes.
annoying because I don't know if you've ever had this where you're like,
Yeah.
because I've struggled with binge eating for so long. And I remember one time
Mhm.
I like, I felt so shitty. And we're normally in a time when I would have binged. And then I was like, God, but I know why I'm going to binge. I don't even want to. And then I was, you know what? I was like,
Yes.
I'm going to do it. Like I actually forced myself to do it. And then I started and I was like, what am I
Yeah.
doing? Like this,
Right.
this doesn't hit anymore. And then I
Yes.
actually told a story on a different podcast. I just sat there being like, this just sucks. And like the drugs don't
Yeah.
work. And like I'm just sitting
Hmm.
here and I have to sit with these stupid ass feelings. And like
Yeah.
there was a time and a place where I literally just could have eaten a whole pizza and ice cream and watched a,
Hmm.
a show I've seen 1,000 times and numbed out. And I
Yeah.
just can't get there anymore. But
Right.
I didn't have quite the skills to sit with the feelings. I just had to sit with it. And like,
Ah.
that's the thing that sucks like that
Absolutely.
there's no sugarcoating it. It is uncomfortable. It's not a good feeling. And you know, when you're working with someone, you're getting them to get there, right? But the
Mhm.
challenging thing is them understanding like means that it's working. Like it's a
Yes.
bit of detox. And like anyone
Hmm.
who's ever gone to rehab, like detox is like it almost feels like you're gonna die. Like this is obviously a
Oh,
smaller
right.
scale of it, but it does
Yeah.
help. But on the
Yeah.
contrary, if you starve yourself and lose 5 pounds, that feels good, right? At
Yep.
least in the immediate sense, it always feels fucking good. And
Hmm.
that's like such a hard thing to, it's an important thing for any client or anyone on it changing to understand that going in that change on
Yeah.
this scale doesn't actually feel good in the beginning, straight up.
Right. Yeah. And it takes a long time
Yeah.
because while you are losing the coping mechanisms that you were using before, you're trying to build new ones. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, that's not working anymore, but this new shit is hard and it
Yeah. Yeah.
sucks. And like, oh, now I have to like journal or meditate or I have to like talk to someone about my feelings and I have to like experience them. Oh, like that feels like too much. It's
Mm.
almost and I have experienced this too. And I've worked with folks who are like, this is so it feels like I don't have enough like time and energy to do all of the work. Like when I open this box, it's like, oof, close that, put that one back. That's gonna take too long. And so one of the other skills is learning how to not compartmentalize forever and never look at it again, but to say, ooh, okay, this feeling sucks. I can identify that this feeling sucks. And also, I can practice something like self compassion where I'm not being capsized by that feeling. I can say, oh, I'm kind of riding the waves on this feeling. I'm not sitting with it completely, but I know that sometime later today or tomorrow, I'm going to make time for myself and I am going to sit with it and I am going to actually process it, not just intellectually, but like to sit with those emotions, and then like I know I'll feel better afterwards. But that is a much longer and more involved process than going for food or getting a new macro plan.
100%. Okay, so we do
Mm-hmm.
need to wrap this up.
Gosh, I know.
Um, I think I was like, this can go on for time. Um,
Seriously.
the last question I'll ask is a quick one.
Mm-hmm.
What is the biggest indirect health advice you can give? What I mean by that is like specifically, it's not actually exercise, nutrition, or recovery related, but you're like,
Mm-hmm.
this can pay dividends in your in the pursuit of health in an indirect manner.
Ooh, well, I want to say go to therapy, but that's not necessarily accessible to everyone. But that would be, if it is accessible to you, definitely go to therapy. Second to that, I would say find a way to help yourself learn to feel safe, regardless of what other people are thinking of you, because that is the seat of being able to set boundaries, to make change, to make space in your own life for yourself. And you need that to be able to do any of this work.
How have you done that?
Ooh, therapy, um, but in addition to that, I really have have made an intentional practice of like learning about my origins, like figuring myself out. Why do I operate the way that I do? Where do these beliefs come from? What's not working for me? And then how do I practice changing that? And practice that in the midst of difficult emotions. Like I still, when I set a boundary, I still go like, whew, was that too straightforward? Like, was that rude? Am I going to upset this person? But I'm like, no, I said that in a clear and assertive way. I didn't say anything mean. I didn't insult them, but I stated, here's what I'm going to do and here's what I'm not going to do. And then I'll just let it go. And the practice over time, like it's gotten a lot easier. And I really celebrate myself when I do something that's difficult like that because I'm like, wow, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have done that.
Mm.
So, like, those skills of just making space in my own life and ensuring that, like, yeah, I still get triggered. I understand what my triggers are. Now I can advocate for myself. I have standards in my life now for how people need to treat me to be in my life. Like,
Mm.
my energy and time are not just accessible to anyone who comes by. And I have a lot of integrity and I'm very proud of that, even though it means like, yeah, at times I've had to make difficult decisions. But reflecting the times when I have not advocated for myself, the times when I've like done what I thought I should do because it was the right thing, those have not worked out well for me. Even though it seemed like the safe thing to do at the time, like, oh, I'm not going to rock the boat. No, absolutely rock the boat. Absolutely rock the boat.
In case anyone didn't believe Gabby, she just pulled out the receipts that she's been to therapy.
I'm gonna send this to my therapist. Like,
I was cooking
thank you
earlier,
so much.
Doc. You should have seen this.
Oh man, really? No, it's been a journey, but yeah, that's why like this is what I feel fulfilled helping people with. And I also came from a history of disordered eating, of constant pursuit of like my leanest body, and it never delivered. This has delivered.
100%. Okay, that's amazing to hear. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Gabby. That was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
I mean, I think you have to come back on at some point because I actually only got through like 2 questions
I know.
and I
There's
had
so
to
much.
end it. But where can people find you?
Yeah, so they can find me on Instagram at Vitamin PhD. If they're interested in gut health stuff, I have retired from gut health, but there still is an Instagram, no BS gut health. So you can find that linked. And if they want to see my poetry, that's Hopeless Hopeful. So everything they can find in my bio at Vitamin PhD. That's the way to go on Instagram.
Okay, amazing. Yeah, and you offer coaching as well.
Yes, I do. Yeah. So I am right now, I've just joined the Be a Body team. So that's with Holly Baxter, and I'm providing exactly what I had described here. I'm not doing any macros, physique, or cosmetic weight loss coaching. And I also am going to start coach education and mentoring again. So I've brought the comprehensive coaching, intentional eating, and RP eating out of the vault. So that is going to be happening very, very soon. I really miss working with coaches. So
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
excited for that.
Okay, so I'll put all the stuff in the show notes. Definitely check out Gabby's Instagram. Her gut health stuff is amazing. Like, if you are confused with the gut health stuff, because there's so much miseducation of this on social media, she's definitely the person I'd go to. And then if you liked how this conversation went, I mean, you would probably enjoy coaching with her too. So I'll put all that stuff down there. And thank you again so much for coming on. That was awesome.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
All right, cheers.